Welcome back to the Distant Vale. Today we're going to be painting up one of the Shrine Anchorites from Trench Crusade. So I have already started painting this and decided about halfway through I wasn't quite happy with the straight through metallic look. So instead what I want to go for is more of like a weathered enamel effect. So what I've got here is a khaki color running through my airbrush. I brought it down to about maybe half of the strength that comes out of the bottle at, just because I want to be really in control here on trying to build up a gradual solid color, but I'm going to leave some of this, the trim metallic that I've already painted beforehand around the edges, and I'm going to weather this down later on to kind of give it this look of an older machine that has been painted, repainted, and then chipped and damaged over time. The metallic that I used was a plate mail air from the Army Painter, and I mixed that with a 50-50 ratio of black acrylic ink, and then just kind of slapped it across the entire thing. Next step, once we've got the khaki done, I'm coming in with a ice yellow, and again about a 50-50 mix of the original paint plus my airbrush paint medium, running that through, just building up closer to the center of the panels that I'm painting, and trying to leave the edges that sort of darker khaki color if I can. Anywhere where I've oversprayed, I'm just letting it dry and seeing how strong it is. If it needs touching up, I'll come back in with the khaki through the airbrush again and just touch up the edges. But I'm hoping that with a nice thin paint, it should be fairly easy to control. The final highlight step is Brain Matter Beige. Again, thin down, run through the airbrush and aiming for the centers of the armor panels that I'm trying to paint up at the moment. I'm not being too precious about trying to preserve the joint components. I'm going to be repainting those anyway. It's just trying to get the bulk of the armor panels done and trying to avoid the chains if I can. I don't really want to have to repaint those because I quite like the look. Once I've done the armor panels, I'm going to come in with an oil wash. And now this is just a burnt umber tone ink. The inks that I use are basically the store brand cheapest you can get from the warehouse. And I have mixed that down to a fairly heavy wash consistency, so you can see that it is toning that sort of pale white color I've got on the panels. So I will be coming in and cleaning it up in a minute, but for now I'm just going to lay that on nice and thick, trying to make sure I get enough of the wash to highlight the details that I'm after, and just avoiding the lamb across the front of the model. The next step from here is to clean up. So I've got some straight mineral turpentine or white spirits in that little container, and I'm just loading it up on a Q-tip. And I'm just going to gently work my way around and just take off a good chunk of the wash that's settled across the flats of the armor panels, trying to preserve as much of that wash as I can in the corners, as well as in the recesses around some of like the rivets and other little detailing around the Mini. There is a central sort of decal on the major armor panel, and I did take a little too much off, so I'm coming back through and reapplying some oil wash to then clean up again, trying to preserve as much of that original shape as possible. Next step, we're just going to start painting some of the wood panels that are dotted around the Mini. So for that, I'm using the Model Air Color Mahogany from Vallejo. Thinned it down just a little bit and are applying a couple of thin coats across the few wood panels dotted in and around the Mini. They're not that many, but I want to try to add a little bit of warmth and variation in the color across the model here. And because it is a fairly sort of washed out and pale brown, I will be coming through and resaturating this with a speed paint. So it doesn't need to be too neat. I don't need to be too precious about where it's getting. The only thing I need to try to avoid is getting it on any of the other details around the armour paneling or the lamb. I'm trying to keep that as close to that original white as possible. And I'm also going to make sure I hit some of the ropes around the lamb's ankles, and then coming through and painting the wood panels on the shield wheel. It is a fairly fiddly process because there is a lot of detail sort of hidden around corners, and sub-assembly always helps with painting these kinds of sort of difficult to reach places. I'm generally not a fan of sub-assembly though, because I'm generally painting to play, and I'd rather have a half-painted model that I can still put on the table than 15 pieces spread across my work table that might take me from my own minis up to sort of 6 months to a year to really get to a quality where I'm happy calling it finished. With the commission pieces, I'm working a lot more consistently on them to get done a little bit faster, but still I'd rather play with my toys than have them sit on the shelf collecting dust. All right, as part of that process of reintroducing a little bit more of a richer brown tone into that wood, I'm going to take some Scrag Brown from Citadel, add a little bit onto a dry brush, work that paint through the bristles on a paper towel, and then just very gently start dry brushing the wood around the wheel, trying to bring out some of that wood texture that is on the sculpt with the dry brush. And the real trick here is to have a very, very slightly moist brush, so just having a little dab of moisture in there as you work it through, and then just being very, very gentle with the hand pressure. So I'm not really pressing down those bristles too hard. I'm just letting the paintbrush do the work, and the sort of paint will collect over time if you let it. The gentler you are, the longer it takes, but the better the end result is generally going to be. And then in order to add a little bit more richness to that wood and to kind of bring that dry brush layer together with that mahogany underneath, I want to take some Pallid Bone Speed Paint from the Army Painter, and just using this undiluted to coat all the wood panels. And what it's going to do is it's going to introduce a little bit of a sort of warm yellow tone to the wood. And it just makes it a little bit more visually interesting. But it does help to tie together that more washed out, desaturated brown that we used as a base coat and the more saturated highlight color that I used. It's a nice little trick to, generally speaking, if you've got two different color browns that maybe aren't quite working well as a sort of base coat highlight pair, adding in a speed paint, contrast paint, sometimes even a wash, can just help bring those colors together and make them look a little bit more visually cohesive. Now, I just want to clean up some of the metallic components that I had a little bit of overspray on with using the airbrush. To get the tone and color that I'm after, you can get away with just using two different speed paints. So I'm going to take some of the Citadel contrast paint, the Silicanum Grey, and I'm using this as a base layer to tint the areas where I've oversprayed down to a grey. And then I'll be coming in with a Rim Black speed paint from the Army Painter to darken it down again. With speed paints, if you're going to work with multiple layers, you have to work in reverse order, where normally with acrylics you build up from darkest to lightest. With speed paints, because they do settle more towards the recesses and pull away from the raised edges, you want to start from your lightest color, which is normally a white, and then progressively add in darker and darker colors, pointing it down to get this. So start with the overspray white, add in the Basilicanum Grey, and then adding in the Grim Black over top. Helps to bring it down to a similar tone to the metallic metallic silver that I've used. But because it's not a metallic, I can only really get away with this because it's the corners and little edges where it's not going to be too visually distracting. And you can kind of help to, again, hide the cleanup work that we're doing here by thinning down that grim black speed paint and adding that to some of the true metallics as well to kind of make that transition in colors feel a little bit more organic and to hide that change from the eye a little bit more easily. And with the cleanup and the speed paints having done their work, I'm now going to move on to painting the flesh colors on the prisoner across the wheel. Now there's two ways you can go about it. You can either paint sort of living flesh or dead flesh. I'm choosing to go with living because that is always the more horrific option. But the steps remain the same regardless of whether you do a warmer sort of peach-based tone like I'm doing, which is the tan flesh from the Army Painter. If you want to do a dead tone, you start with something that's a little bit more into the greens or the purples, and then build up paler than you would with living flesh. But because it's alive, it wants to be a little bit warmer, a little bit more towards the red. So you start with those sort of pinky peachy colors, or introducing a red into whatever skin tone you want to be using to make it feel more lived. And now the next step is to apply the first highlight on the skin cut tone. As for that, I'm using Adian Flesh Tone from Citadel. And I'm just doing a really chunky, blocky highlight. I find when I'm working with bigger, sort of less defined organic shapes, I almost want to be painting it like a cell shading in a animation works, where you want to have big blocky colors that sort of approximate the highlights. And the reason why I want to do this is it is far easier to paint in that detail starting with big blocks and then glaze down or hide the transitions down the track than it is to try to gently glaze that up on a big flat area. For the second highlight, I'm using Kislar Flesh, again from Citadel. And then once I've got the big panel blocks painted in, I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of the original tanned flesh and Cadian Flesh Tone. I'm just going to glaze over the transition point on that blocky highlight shade. And then I'm going to do the same thing again with the Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislar Flesh, mixing it 50-50, thinning it down, and just applying it pretty much only to that transition point to help smooth out that gradient from lightest to darkest. And with the skin tone on the victim on the wheel finished, we're now on to the fine details. There is some like paneling accents on the face of the shrine. So for that, I want to paint it up like a warm gold. To start that off, I'm going to be basing it with a Balthasar bronze, I believe it is, from Citadel. It's their sort of like warm gold bronze base color. And it does have pretty good coverage. You're going to find that with a lot of gold paints, they are very, very poor covering paints, and you have to do quite a number of layers to build it up. Whereas we start from something that's a little bit darker and that covers better, you don't have to do quite so many layers to build up a believable true metallic gold. And with that last little bit of panels painted, we can move on to the next step, which is to take some greedy gold from the army painter. I'm going to use this to highlight up those inner panels. Now we're going to do a very similar method to what I did with the wood texture, and then I'm going to do just a fairly rough and chunky highlight on that paneling. So in a similar way we used the dry brushing to add in a highlight without it necessarily being a nice clean highlight. So just aiming to get highest portion of those inner crosses, and then what I'm going to do is take some pallid bone, again using that wash to full advantage, so the contrast paint to full advantage, to tone everything in that area down and help tie things together. So taking that pallid bone and just working it nice and gently into the panels. And then I'm also allowing this to cover over into some of the sort of surrounding panels on the face. And what that's going to do is it's going to help to, again, clean up a little bit of the overspray from when I was doing the armor panels, but also helps to tie that visual look of the warm gold into the cooler silvers across the face. I'm also just going to use some of this pallid bone just to provide a dirty rag look to the cloth on the prisoner attached to the wheel. Right, final major step to finish this model off will be to do a quick dry brush of some Runefang steel across the true metallic components of the Mini. This will just help to add some final definition to those metallic shapes. But although this is a good enough look to finish things off, I do want to take things one step further, and I'll be doing some sort of optional extra weathering across those enamel plates. So to do that, I want to start with a sponging of some Rhinoxide. So I'm just taking a slightly damp sponge, loading it up with a little bit of Rhinoxide paint, working a good chunk of that off on a paper towel. So I'm left with just a little bit to add some speckle patterns. I'm going to be applying this to the those big white armor panels to sort of show a bit of wear and tear on the enamel paint. I'm aiming this mostly towards the corners of panels or the lower portions of panels to help provide a bit of a believable look of wear and tear on the Shrine Anchorite. Next, to add a little bit of liquid grime, I'm going to take some Seraphim Sepia from Citadel in their watercolors, and I'm just going to take this straight from the pot on a nice small brush, load up a couple of drops, and I'm going to very gently run this down the model in vertical lines to help provide the look of sort of liquid grime streaking across those armor panels. I'm going to go pretty heavy on this, but I'm going to help break this up visually a little bit in the next step by adding in a different color. So the Seraphim Sepia is a like almost yellowy brown. It's quite warm, and it does kind of match with a lot of the other colors that we've used on the panels. And to help provide a little bit of visual distinction, I'm been mixing in some military shader, which is a green from the Army Painter. And this green wash is going to be used in the exact same way, where I'm just going to be doing vertical lines, trying to do a few separate from the sepia tone that we've used on the model, but also doing a few where they're layered over the top of each other, just to help it feel a little bit more lived, real, dirty, and gross. Now, with that all looking grim, gross, and dirty, there's one final detail left to do, and that is some blood splatters and some bleeding throats on the sacrificed lamb across the front of the anchorite. So the model is sculpted with a cut and neck. I'm going to use that as a guide, loaded up with a bunch of contrast paint from Citadel. I'm using their Blood Angels Red. It is a very strong contrast paint, so it works quite nicely to provide some sort of goopy red blood. And then I'm going to take a flat brush, I'm just going to flick it to get some blood splatters across the mini to finish off. Hey team, thanks for sticking around to the end. Really appreciating the ongoing support as we make our way through the Trench Crusade catalogue. I'm hoping to get a few more of these models done over the next couple of weeks. But until the next video, I'll catch you around.